In the summer of 1944, somewhere in the dense hedgerows of Normandy, a German infantryman paused, listening for something he had been trained to expect. For years, the rhythm of battle had been predictable. A shot, then a pause, another shot, then silence. That brief moment when an enemy soldier worked the bolt of his rifle was the window to move, to fire back, to survive. But now, that rhythm was gone. Instead, the air was filled with a rapid, relentless cracking of gunfire. No pause, no hesitation, just continuous aimed shots coming from American positions. To the Germans, it sounded as if every U.S. soldier carried a machine gun. What they were hearing was the M1 Garand, a weapon that had quietly rewritten the rules of infantry combat before the war had even begun. To understand why this was so shocking, you have to step back into the mindset of the 1930s. At that time, nearly every major military power in the world trusted the same kind of rifle they had used during the First World War: bolt action. Weapons like the German K-98K, the British Lee Enfield, and the Soviet Mosin Nagant were accurate, reliable, and simple. But they all shared one critical limitation. After every shot, the soldier had to manually cycle the bolt, lifting it, pulling it back, pushing it forward, and locking it down again before firing the next round. That process took time. Even in the hands of a well-trained soldier, it created a natural pause between shots, and military doctrine was built around that pause. Armies expected firefights to move in bursts and intervals. Tactics, training, even battlefield movement, all of it assumed that no single rifleman could maintain a continuous stream of fire. Semi-automatic rifles did exist, but they were seen as complicated, expensive, and often unreliable. Many military leaders believed they wasted ammunition and encouraged undisciplined firing. The idea of issuing such a weapon to every infantryman wasn't just controversial, it seemed impractical. And yet, in 1936, the United States Army made a decision that no other major power was willing to make. It adopted a semi-automatic rifle as its standard-issue weapon for all infantry soldiers. This wasn't a limited experiment, it wasn't reserved for elite units, it was a complete shift in philosophy. The average American rifleman would no longer fire one shot at a time with pauses in between. He would be able to fire 8 rounds as quickly as he could pull the trigger, with no need to manually cycle the weapon after each shot. At the center of this decision was a quiet, methodical engineer named John Cantius Garand. Working at Springfield Armory, Garand spent years refining a design that could meet the Army's demanding requirements. His rifle used a gas-operated system, harnessing the energy from fired rounds to automatically cycle the action. It fed from an 8-round on-block clip, which could be inserted quickly and ejected automatically when empty with a distinctive metallic ping. The design was elegant, but getting there was anything but easy. Early prototypes failed, trials exposed weaknesses, competing designs challenged Garand's work. There were concerns about cost, maintenance, and whether soldiers in the field could handle a more complex weapon. Even after adoption, production delays and logistical challenges slowed its rollout. Skepticism wasn't limited to engineers and procurement officers. Many military thinkers questioned whether a semi-automatic rifle would actually improve battlefield performance. They worried that soldiers would fire too quickly, burn through ammunition, and lose fire discipline. After all, armies had spent decades teaching controlled, deliberate shooting. But the United States was betting on something different. Instead of limiting the individual soldier, it aimed to amplify him. The idea was simple but powerful. If every rifleman could deliver rapid, accurate fire, then the entire squad would become exponentially more effective. This approach stood in sharp contrast to other nations. German infantry doctrine, for example, centered around the machine gun as the primary source of firepower. Riflemen were there to support the machine gun, protect it, and maneuver around it. Their bolt-action rifles were secondary tools. The American approach flipped that idea. With the M1 Garand, every soldier became a source of sustained firepower. The squad no longer depended as heavily on a single weapon. Instead, it could generate a high volume of fire from multiple positions at once. On paper, it was a bold theory. In practice, it would prove devastating. By the time the United States entered the war, the M1 Garand was already being issued in large numbers. American troops carried it into the jungles of the Pacific, the deserts of North Africa, and eventually the fields and forests of Europe. Wherever it went, it brought with it a fundamental shift in how firefights unfolded. For soldiers on the receiving end, the difference was immediate and unsettling. The absence of that familiar pause, the split second when an enemy rifle went silent, created a constant pressure. There was no safe moment to move, no predictable rhythm to exploit. The battlefield felt faster, more chaotic, and far more dangerous. And for the Americans carrying it, the rifle inspired confidence. It allowed them to maintain pressure on the enemy, to dominate engagements at the squad level, and to fight with a level of firepower that other infantry units simply couldn't match. What began as a controversial decision in 1936 had, by the mid-1940s, become one of the defining advantages of the U.S. Army. The M1 Garand didn't just change how soldiers fired their weapons, it changed how they fought, how they moved, and ultimately, how they won. And in places like Normandy, where every second could mean the difference between life and death, that change was impossible to ignore. Long before the rifle earned its reputation on the battlefields of World War II, it existed only as a stubborn idea, one that many believed would never work in practice. Turning that idea into a reliable weapon fell to a man who rarely sought attention, a quiet engineer named John Cantius Garand. Garand was not a flashy inventor or a self-promoter. Born in Canada and later moving to the United States, he developed a reputation at Springfield Armory as someone who solved problems others couldn't. He approached engineering with patience and precision, the kind that required years of trial and error rather than quick breakthroughs. And the challenge placed in front of him was one of the most difficult in small arms design: create a semi-automatic rifle that was not only effective, but durable enough for the chaos of war. At the time, many earlier attempts at semi-automatic rifles had failed for a simple reason: they were too complicated. Dirt, mud, sand, and cold temperatures would jam delicate mechanisms. Parts would wear down too quickly. Soldiers in the field couldn't afford a weapon that worked only under ideal conditions. A military rifle had to function after being dropped, dragged, soaked, and frozen. Garand understood this better than anyone. His design centered around a gas-operated system, a concept that used the expanding gases from a fired cartridge to cycle the rifle's action automatically. Instead of requiring the soldier to manually operate a bolt, the rifle would load the next round on its own. It sounds simple in theory, but in practice, balancing the pressure, timing, and durability of such a system was incredibly complex. Early prototypes revealed just how difficult this balance was. Some designs cycled too violently, damaging internal parts. Others didn't generate enough force to reliably chamber the next round. There were feeding issues, extraction failures, and countless small mechanical problems that had to be solved one by one. Each failure meant going back to the drawing board. At one point, Garand's original design used a different caliber altogether, which led to further complications. The U.S. Army eventually standardized around the 30-06 Springfield cartridge, forcing Garand to adapt his rifle to a more powerful round. This wasn't a minor adjustment. It required rethinking how the entire system handled pressure and recoil. And Garand wasn't working in isolation. His rifle was constantly being tested against competing designs. Other engineers and companies were also trying to create a viable semi-automatic rifle, and the Army was not committed to Garand's solution alone. Trials were intense and unforgiving. Rifles were pushed to their limits, exposed to harsh environments, and evaluated not just for performance, but for ease of production and maintenance. What set Garand's work apart was not perfection, but persistence. Each round of testing revealed flaws, and each flaw became a problem to solve. Over time, his design became simpler, stronger, and more reliable. Parts were refined, mechanisms were streamlined. The rifle evolved into something that could withstand the abuse of real combat. One of the most distinctive features of the final design was its feeding system, the 8-round N-block clip. Unlike detachable magazines used in later rifles, this clip was inserted directly into the rifle and ejected automatically when empty. It allowed for quick reloading under pressure and kept the design relatively simple. That small metallic ping it made when ejecting would later become one of the most recognizable sounds of the war. But even as the rifle improved, doubts remained. Military planners worried about logistics. A semi-automatic rifle required more precision manufacturing, which meant higher costs and more complex production. Could American industry produce enough of them in time for war? Could soldiers be trained to maintain them properly? Would they consume ammunition too quickly in combat? These weren't trivial concerns. Armies had to think not just about performance, but about supply chains, training programs, and long-term sustainability. A weapon could be brilliant on the test range and still fail as a standard-issue rifle if it proved too difficult to produce or maintain at scale. Despite all of this, Garand's rifle continued to prove itself where it mattered most, in testing under realistic conditions. It demonstrated reliability across thousands of rounds. It functioned in dirt and adverse weather. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that an average soldier could use it effectively without extensive retraining. By 1936, after years of development, testing, and refinement, the U.S. Army made its decision. Garand's rifle would be adopted as the standard service weapon. It was a moment that marked the end of a long and uncertain journey, not just for Garand, but for the concept of the semi-automatic infantry rifle itself. Even then, the work was far from over. Adoption was only the beginning. Factories had to be retooled, workers had to be trained, production had to be scaled up from prototypes to hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of rifles. Every component had to meet strict standards because even a small defect could mean failure in combat. Through it all, Garand remained largely in the background. He didn't seek recognition or fame. In fact, he famously declined to accept royalties for his invention, believing that his work was part of his duty as a government employee. While others debated doctrine and strategy, he focused on making the rifle as reliable as possible. What emerged from that process was more than just a weapon. It was a solution to a problem that had challenged engineers and armies for decades. A rifle that could deliver rapid fire without sacrificing durability. A machine that balanced complexity with reliability in ways that few thought possible. By the time American soldiers carried the M1 Garand into battle, it had already survived years of testing, skepticism, and refinement. It was no longer an experimental idea. It was a proven tool, built to endure the harshest conditions imaginable. And soon, in the hands of millions of soldiers, it would prove that all those years of effort had been worth it. By the time the United States was pulled into World War II, the rifle that had once been debated in testing rooms was about to face its true trial, combat. No amount of engineering, no number of controlled tests could fully predict how a weapon would perform in the chaos of war. The real question was simple. Would it work when everything went wrong? The answer began to unfold in the closing days of 1941 in the Philippines. American and Filipino forces, cut off and outnumbered, were among the first to carry the M1 Garand into sustained combat. Conditions were brutal: heat, humidity, mud, and constant pressure from advancing Japanese troops. Supplies were limited, maintenance was difficult, and soldiers were pushed to their physical limits. And yet, the rifle held up. In an environment where weapons were exposed to dirt, sweat, and neglect, reliability became everything. A jammed rifle wasn't just an inconvenience, it could mean death. The M1 Garand's gas-operated system, refined through years of testing, proved capable of cycling round after round even under these harsh conditions. Soldiers quickly learned that they could trust it, and that trust translated directly into confidence in combat. As the war expanded, the rifle followed American forces into entirely different environments. In North Africa, it faced dry, dusty deserts where fine sand could infiltrate every moving part. In Italy, it endured rain, mud, and mountainous terrain. Later, in the forests and snow-covered fields of Europe, it would be exposed to freezing temperatures that caused other weapons to seize up. Across all of these battlefields, the pattern repeated itself. The M1 Garand continued to function. But reliability was only part of the story. What truly set the rifle apart was how it changed the way firefights unfolded. For the first time, the average infantryman could deliver rapid, accurate fire without breaking his shooting position. There was no need to lift his head, shift his grip, or interrupt his aim to cycle a bolt. Each pull of the trigger meant another shot downrange, as fast as he could control it. This gave American soldiers a level of sustained firepower that was difficult for their enemies to match. German infantry, for example, were still largely equipped with bolt-action rifles like the Kar-98K. These weapons were precise and dependable, but they required manual operation after each shot. Even the most skilled soldier could not match the rate of fire of a semi-automatic rifle without sacrificing accuracy or control. Germany did attempt to bridge this gap with weapons like the Gewehr 41. On paper, it was a response to the same problem the Americans had solved. In reality, it struggled. The Gewehr 41 was more complex, less reliable, and sensitive to dirt and fouling. Many soldiers found it difficult to maintain in field conditions, and it never fully replaced the standard bolt-action rifles. Later designs, like the Gewehr 43, improved on these issues, but by the time they were introduced in significant numbers, the war was already turning against Germany. The advantage that the United States had gained by adopting a semi-automatic rifle early was already firmly established. On the battlefield, these differences became painfully clear. In engagements where American and German infantry clashed, the volume of fire coming from U.S. positions was noticeably higher. A squad equipped with M1 Garands could put out a continuous stream of bullets, forcing the enemy to take cover and limiting their ability to maneuver. For soldiers used to fighting against bolt-action rifles, this was disorienting. The expected pauses between shots simply weren't there. Instead of brief bursts of fire followed by silence, there was constant pressure. Every attempt to move or reposition was met with immediate response. This wasn't just a matter of firepower, it was psychological. The sound of repeated, rapid shots created the impression of greater numbers, of overwhelming force. Even when facing a relatively small unit, enemy soldiers could feel as if they were outgunned. At the same time, American troops learned how to use this advantage effectively. Training emphasized controlled, aimed fire rather than reckless shooting. Soldiers were taught to maintain discipline even with the increased rate of fire available to them. The goal wasn't just to shoot more, but to shoot more effectively. The 8-round en blanc clip played a role in this dynamic. It allowed for quick reloading under pressure, ensuring that soldiers could stay in the fight with minimal interruption. While it did require the entire clip to be loaded at once, its simplicity made it reliable and easy to use in stressful situations. Of course, no weapon was perfect. The M1 Garand was heavier than many bolt-action rifles, and its distinctive ping when the clip injected would later become the subject of debate and myth. But these drawbacks were minor compared to the advantages it offered in combat. By the time American forces moved deeper into Europe, the rifle had proven itself beyond doubt.
It had survived the jungles of the Pacific, the deserts of Africa, and the cold of European winters. It had functioned in conditions that tested both men and machines to their limits. More importantly, it had demonstrated that the concept behind it, the idea of a semi-automatic standard-issue rifle, was not only viable, but superior. What had once been seen as a risky and unconventional decision was now a clear advantage. The years of development, the skepticism, and the challenges of production had all led to this moment. The rifle worked, and in the hands of American soldiers, it was helping to shape the outcome of battles across multiple continents. The true impact of that advantage would become even more visible in the months to come, in places where terrain, tactics, and timing would collide in some of the most intense fighting of the war.
By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a deciding moment. Allied forces had landed in France, and the fight to break out from the beaches had begun. What followed was not a rapid advance, but a slow, brutal struggle through one of the most unforgiving battlefields of the war, the hedgerows of Normandy, part of the larger Battle of Normandy. This was not open terrain. The countryside was divided by thick earthen embankments covered in dense vegetation, forming natural walls that could be several feet high. These hedgerows created a maze of narrow fields and hidden pathways. Visibility was limited. Movement was dangerous. Every corner, every gap could conceal an enemy waiting in ambush. For both sides, combat here was intimate and sudden. Engagements often happened at close range with little warning. A patrol could move quietly along a hedgerow, turn a corner, and find itself face to face with the enemy. In these moments, speed and firepower meant everything. German forces defending the region were experienced and well-positioned. They understood the terrain and used it to their advantage, setting up interlocking fields of fire and carefully planned defensive positions. Their tactics relied on ambush, precision, and coordinated use of machine guns and riflemen. But something unexpected began to happen as these engagements unfolded. German soldiers trained to fight against bolt-action rifles quickly noticed that the Americans were not behaving the way they anticipated. The usual rhythm of combat, the pause between shots, was missing. Instead, American troops were able to deliver rapid, continuous fire the moment contact was made. In the tight confines of the hedgerows, this difference was magnified. There was no room to maneuver widely, no easy way to flank without exposing yourself. Fire superiority at the point of contact became the deciding factor. And in that moment, the M1 Garand gave American soldiers a critical edge. A single U.S. infantryman could fire multiple aimed shots in the time it took a German soldier to cycle his bolt and fire again. Multiply that across an entire squad, and the effect was overwhelming. The volume of fire coming from American positions could pin down defenders almost instantly, disrupting their plans and forcing them to react rather than act. For German troops, this created a growing sense of unease. The battlefield no longer behaved in a predictable way. The assumptions they had trained with about timing, movement, and opportunity were no longer reliable. Every attempt to reposition, to peek over cover, or to return fire carried greater risk because the response was immediate. Some accounts describe German soldiers believing they were facing far more machine guns than were actually present. In reality, much of that firepower was coming from ordinary riflemen equipped with semi-automatic weapons. The distinction didn't matter in the moment. What mattered was the effect. Constant pressure, no safe pause, no easy opening. American troops, on the other hand, learned to exploit this advantage. In the confined spaces of the hedgerows, they could quickly bring multiple rifles to bear on a single point, overwhelming defenders before they had time to react. Fire and movement became more fluid, more aggressive. Instead of waiting for opportunities, they could create them. This shift didn't eliminate the dangers of the battlefield. The hedgerows remained deadly. German defenses were still formidable, and progress was often measured in yards rather than miles. But the ability to generate sustained, accurate fire at the squad level gave American units a tool that fit the environment perfectly. It wasn't just about shooting faster, it was about controlling the tempo of the fight. In traditional engagements dominated by bolt-action rifles, firefights often settled into a pattern, shots exchanged, positions held, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. In Normandy, that pattern was disrupted. The side that could apply continuous pressure had the advantage, and more often than not, that was the Americans. As the campaign continued, this advantage contributed to the gradual breakdown of German defensive lines. Field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, American forces pushed forward. The fighting was costly and exhausting, but the balance was shifting. The M1 Garand was not the only factor in this outcome. Artillery, air support, leadership, and logistics all played critical roles. But at the level of the individual soldier, the moment when two opposing forces met face to face, the rifle made a difference that was immediate and tangible. For the German infantrymen in Normandy, the lesson was learned quickly and often under fire. The enemy they faced was not just another army equipped with familiar weapons, it was a force whose basic tools had changed the nature of the fight. And in the close, unforgiving terrain of the hedgerows, that change could be felt with every pull of the trigger.
By the final months of the war in Europe, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Allied forces were advancing from multiple directions, German defenses were collapsing, and the conflict that had consumed entire continents was drawing to a close. But even as the fighting continued, there was already a growing recognition among soldiers and commanders that certain innovations had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. Among them was the M1 Garand. It had started as a controversial idea, resisted by tradition and questioned by experts. Yet through years of development and the ultimate test of combat, it proved something that would reshape infantry tactics for generations. The standard rifleman could be far more than a single-shot participant in battle. He could be a consistent source of sustained, accurate fire. Few voices carried more weight in recognizing this than George S. Patton, one of the most prominent American commanders of the war. He famously described the M1 Garand as the greatest battle implement ever devised. It was a bold statement, especially in a conflict defined by tanks, aircraft, and massive artillery. But Patton wasn't speaking about scale. He was speaking about impact at the level where wars are actually fought, the individual soldier. Because in the end, no matter how advanced the machinery of war becomes, victory still depends on the effectiveness of the men on the ground. The M1 Garand gave those men an advantage that was both practical and psychological. It allowed them to engage the enemy with confidence, to maintain pressure, and to control the tempo of firefights in a way that had rarely been possible before. It reduced hesitation. It removed the need to break focus between shots. It made every soldier more capable in the moments that mattered most. As American forces pushed into Germany through cities reduced to rubble and across rivers under fire, the rifle continued to perform. It had already proven itself in jungles, deserts, mountains, and frozen forests. Now, in the final stages of the European War, it remained as reliable as ever, a constant in an environment defined by uncertainty. But its legacy didn't end with the surrender of Germany in May 1945. The success of the M1 Garand sent a clear message to the rest of the world. The era of the bolt-action service rifle was coming to an end. The advantages of semi-automatic fire were no longer theoretical, they were undeniable. Nations that had hesitated before the war now began to rethink their approach to infantry weapons. In the years that followed, this shift accelerated. New rifles were developed, building on the principles that Garand's design had proven in combat.
Some would go even further, introducing select fire capabilities and detachable magazines, but the foundation had already been laid. The idea that every infantryman should be equipped with a fast-firing, reliable rifle became the new standard. Even as newer weapons replaced it in frontline service, the M1 Garand did not disappear. It continued to serve in the early years of the Cold War, including during the Korean War, where it once again demonstrated its durability and effectiveness under harsh conditions. For many soldiers, it remained a trusted companion, a weapon they could rely on when everything else was uncertain. Over time, it became something more than just a military tool. It became a symbol of a turning point in military history, a symbol of the industrial and technological power that the United States brought to the war, and for those who carried it, a symbol of survival. Today, decades after the end of World War II, the M1 Garand is still remembered with a level of respect that few weapons achieve. Historians study it, collectors preserve it. Veterans, when they speak about their experiences, often mention it not as a piece of equipment, but almost as a partner. Because in the chaos of war, when decisions are made in seconds and outcomes are measured in lives, trust matters more than anything. What began as a risky decision in 1936 became one of the defining advantages of American infantry forces. It changed how battles were fought, how soldiers moved, and how firepower was distributed across the battlefield. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that innovation, when backed by persistence, testing, and belief, can alter the course of history in ways that are felt far beyond the moment of its creation. The echo of that innovation can still be heard today, not just in museums or history books, but in every modern rifle that owes something to the path the M1 Garand helped carve.